Well, hello, Resurrection Church friends and others who may be listening along. The session of our church, the elders of our church thought that it was worth some extended reflection and thought about where we are at, where the world is at. And so I've been spending some time kind of reflecting theologically about where we find ourselves, because frankly it's bewildering. And as I thought, as I prayed, as I worked, as I read, Habakkuk chapter 3 kept coming up over and over again. We preached on this text a few years ago in our church, and it had kind of stuck with me. And so I've taken an old sermon and kind of reworked it, rethought it, replanned it out. In the beginning, that was partially for the benefit of my own heart, so that I would kind of be in the right place to understand myself in the midst of this time and my own family and everything else. But I hope that my thoughts and reflections will be helpful to you as well. It's probably best if you follow along, and so if you grab a Bible, analog or digital or whatever. I'm going to first read Habakkuk chapter 3, and then we'll kind of jump into the message that I prepared on this topic. Habakkuk chapter 3, it's entitled Habakkuk's Prayer. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to the Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of years revive it. In the midst of years make it known. In wrath remember mercy. God came down from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence. Plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers? Or your indignation against the sea? When you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? You stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the sea with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place, as the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. You marched through the nations in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed from the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters, I hear, my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will wait quietly for the day of trouble to come upon those who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the trees, on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choir master with stringed instruments. Habakkuk is perhaps my favorite prophet. He has some of the most direct interactions with God. He's one of the more doubting, one of the more questioning prophets. If you read his book, it isn't very long, just 3 chapters. He complains and then complains again. He receives answers from God from his complaints, but they are never what he's hoping for. See, Habakkuk is given a picture of the future. It includes a soon-to-happen victory by Babylon over Israel, but then also this long-term vision of Babylon's eventual demise and punishment. And in response to these two visions, these two revelations, Habakkuk composes a prayerful song here in chapter 3. Now, how do we know it's a prayerful song? Well, if you looked in verse 1, it says that the prayer is to be offered according to the Shigionoth. Now, that's likely a reference to a well-known tune. It's an instruction about the tune that you would sing this song to. It's like saying, sing this song to the tune of Amazing Grace, or the ABCs, or just something well-known. And then in the last verse, the very last line, there's a note about stringed instruments. Well, Habakkuk is telling us about the accompaniment. He wants the song to be sung to a particular tune. He doesn't want it sung a cappella. He wants it sung with instruments. There's some sort of orchestral or accompaniment of some kind. See, he has composed a response to God, to the things that God has told him, and it's a distinct possibility that this became a song that was included in Israelite worship. According to scholars, smart Bible people, they'll tell you that this song has a chorus. That's how it begins. It has 3 verses, and then it has a bridge. And I want to show you in this message how we know that and where you can see all those things. But more importantly, this isn't just a Bible study. I want to show you how these ancient words take on a whole new meaning in our time. Remember, this song is a response to Revelation. It's a picture of what it means to look at God's plan for the world, what God is unfolding for the world, and respond to it. Which I think is so beautiful and helpful, because in the scriptures, we don't just get facts about God. We don't just get bare information about how the world is. We get teaching on what it means to respond to that. Now, the central idea in this psalm, the central idea in all of Habakkuk is, what is faith? What does it mean to believe? What does it mean to believe, especially in a world where all signs of blessing are absent, where the enemies are winning? What does it mean to believe in God continually when nothing seems to square with what you thought you knew about him? Habakkuk is just concerned with the questions, what are we supposed to do in the moments that are given to us? It's an ancient question. It's a modern one as well. What does it mean to live a life of faith? What does it mean to live a life of faith when the pillars of our society are shaking and tottering, where no one seems to have any answers, and life in front of us is a sea of uncertainty? I think Habakkuk's prayer song will point the way. So the song begins with the chorus. That's what I told you. A chorus is a repeated refrain. It's the part of the song you sing over and over. If you look at verse 2, it's there. It says, O Lord, I've heard the report of you. Your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of years, revive it. In the midst of years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. This is what Habakkuk is praying about in his chorus. He starts with God. He says, I've heard the report about you. I've heard the report about God. He knows God's reputation, and he fears God's work. What is God's reputation? What is his work? Well, if you go back and read Habakkuk chapter 1, Habakkuk chapter 2, what do you find there? We find that God actually works in mysterious ways. Because what he's doing is he's using a wicked nation, the nation of Babylon, to punish a less wicked nation. He's permitting evil to some degree. He's working on a long plan as well to eventually punish this wicked nation for its wickedness. But God's reputation and his work is to lift up righteousness and to put down evil. And he's operating on this massive timeline, almost incomprehensible. It's sort of like a glacial pace, because glaciers, they move incredibly slowly. They either grow or recede incredibly slowly, but they're basically unstoppable. He doesn't just use people or tribes. He's using civilization, like movements of world history, to accomplish his will. And he's not capricious. He's not random. He isn't constantly changing his mind. He's not subject to the whims of the moment, the flights of fancy, as in the myths of the pagan gods. He's unchanging. He's forever. He's constant. He's generation to generation. A God like that, when we even begin to think on him, it's a bit fear-inducing. Because it's not a tame God. It's a wild God. A free-range God, a God who does not answer to us. But the chorus doesn't just end with God's character and reputation. Habakkuk remains hopeful that this God, the ageless, timeless God, will intervene as he has in the past. Did you see that in verse 2? He asks God, in the midst of years, revive your work. Make it known. Show mercy. In the midst of years, that phrase probably means Habakkuk's lifespan. It could mean something more specific than that. We aren't exactly sure. But if you read that phrase in light of the rest of the book, it fits because we know Habakkuk is eager for God to act soon. So Habakkuk prays, what if you do more work in our time? What if you act like the God I've read about, I know about from the past? What if I can see it? It's a hope, but it's also a bit of a subtle protest that Habakkuk hasn't quite given up. See, God's told him, I'm going to destroy Israel, I'm eventually going to destroy Babylon, but Habakkuk is thinking maybe something will change. Maybe God will show up in a mighty way to intervene. It's some sort of cross between hope and protest. Habakkuk hasn't totally given in, and it feels a lot like our moment. From what scientists and disease experts tell us, we have an idea of the trouble that's to come should God not intervene. The trouble to come seems unshakable. It seems irresistible. But we know what kind of God we have. We have a God who loves to rescue, a God who loves to come through, who has done mighty works in the past. And this can be our prayer in this moment as well. In the midst of our years, O God, revive it. Do it again. Remember mercy. Remember compassion. Let all the people see you. This is the chorus of Habakkuk's song. And that leads us then into the 3 verses of his song, which function as expressions of God's reputation and work. And what Habakkuk's doing is he's singing the memories of God's people. He's reminding himself in this dark time what God has done in the past. And if you look carefully at this text, especially if you have an analog Bible, you'll see there are more musical notations here. There are 3 selahs in this chapter. Just like the ones that we find in the Psalms, there's one in the middle of verse 3, one in the middle of verse 9, and one at the end of verse 13. And each selah comes after the first line of each of the verses. And it sort of expresses the theme of each verse. So here's what I mean. The chorus is verse 2, and then in verse 3, the first line of that verse begins, is that God has come from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. And then there's a selah to indicate this is sort of the end of the first line. It's the theme. Now, what does that mean, that God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran? Well, these places were significant stops made by Israel in the wilderness after they were freed from Egypt. Both of these places are south of Israel. They generally refer to the area ruled by the Edomites and in the desert of the Sinai region. That word might feel familiar because Mount Sinai was the place where God gave the law to his people, the famous 10 Commandments and others. So what Habakkuk's doing here is he's recalling Israel's experience with God as God very directly and very obviously led them from Egypt to the Promised Land, providing for their needs along the way. And remember that during this season, God was very visibly present with his people. He led them by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. He was obviously with them. It was unmistakable. If you look in verse 4, it recalls that in some of the battles of Israel, God sent hailstones and thunderstorms to help his people. Verse 5 recalls that God used plagues and pests on the nation of Egypt to free his people from the rule of the Pharaoh. Verse 6, the references to eternal mountains and everlasting hills, it's probably a reference to idol worship. The Baals, the Ashtoreths, were worshipped in Canaan before Israel arrived, and they'd always set these things up on high places and hills. And it says here that God is scattering them. He's laying them low. It's his obvious work to give Canaan to his people. And verse 7 refers to the tents of Cushan, the land of Midian. These are people that Israel passed by on the way to the Holy Land but did not destroy. And these people are trembling, wondering, is God going to lead Israel to fight them as well? And this section finishes by asking, was God mad at the rivers? Was he mad at the sea? No, he didn't part the Red Sea or the Jordan River because he was angry with it. Rather, he parted these waters so that his people could get through them. The whole of verse 1 of Habakkuk's song, which is verses 3 through 8, it's this collage of images from Israelite history of when God showed up in dramatic ways. That is the theme. Habakkuk is singing about when it was clear that God was with his people, and this is when the chorus, verse 2, takes on more meaning. Because it's coming back. I know you, God. I know your work. I know what you once did. Renew that in our day. See, what Habakkuk wants is he wants that God back. He wants the obvious God back, the visible God, the God who is clearly on the side of his people. And look, isn't that what we all want too? Don't we want the obvious God? Wouldn't it be great if he showed up again in that way? Okay, verse 2. It begins in verse 9. The theme here, he says, is that you stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. The imagery of a warrior is going to be very prominent in this second section, the second verse. But this warrior is no mere human. Look at the kind of weapons he's wielding. Verse 9 talks about him using rivers to split the earth. Verse 10, mountains are being wielded, then the deep ocean itself. Verse 11, the sun and the moon are weapons. God is bringing all of nature into line with his plan. He's using them just as he uses nations and civilizations. He's marshaling the created universe and he's bending it to his will. For what purpose? In verse 13, you went out for the salvation of your people. To what end does God use his immense power? To what end does he destroy enemies? For the salvation of his people, for their rescue. See, over and over, God had rescued his people. He defeated armies. He'd used elements of creation to fight alongside his people. He was committed to them. He came through for them time after time. And this truth about God rescuing them, it would have been very prominent, very important for Habakkuk as he considered the near future of Babylon coming and besieging and destroying Jerusalem and destroying the temple. He would have been wondering, why not now? Where's that warrior God who fights for his people, who destroys their attackers? And so he sings and he prays in the midst of our years. Become that warrior again. Fight for your people. Deliver us from our enemies. What a beautiful thing to pray and to sing, especially for us when creation is our enemy, when our biology is what threatens us. It's a perfect time to appeal to the creator of everything that is when we ask God to curtail something in his creation for us. Okay, third verse of the song. It's in the middle of 13. It says, you crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. This short third verse pictures a wicked king or some other person leading the enemies against God's people. Habakkuk might have had the king of Babylon in mind. It might be figurative, the king of evil more generically. But against this evil leader, God triumphs. Being laid bare from thigh to neck, as you might imagine, refers to total embarrassment, total destruction, total weakness. This evil leader, according to verse 14, had come like a whirlwind. He was going to scatter. He was going to devour the poor in secret, but God defeats him with his own arrows. He makes him destroy himself. See, Habakkuk here is longing for more than just God's defeat of the human enemies of Israel. He wants the whole head of wickedness destroyed. He remembers all the kings who stood against Israel and how God dealt with them. And he wants to see it again. He wants that to be remade in his day. So let's summarize the verses in the chorus. Habakkuk has recalled God's obvious leading and guiding of Israel on the way to the promised land, his protection from enemies, his destruction of the wicked, his humiliation of the leaders of evil. He's been remembering the days when God was clearly and obviously present, and he wants to see those days again. He wants them renewed. He wants it to happen in his lifetime. Now, this isn't a bad hope. It's not a wrong hope. If you've been a Christian for a while, I bet you can see yourself in this kind of request. You can look back at some part of your life and remember the sort of the more palpable presence of God. Maybe it was the time when you first believed the gospel. Maybe it was a missions trip or a summer camp, a very tangible answer to prayer. And you just want those days back again. It's not wrong to look for God's presence in more tangible ways. It isn't wrong to ask for it. And perhaps even this piece of scripture was given to us that we might learn to give voice to those longings. What we need to feel in a time like the one we are in is the desire for God to move. Difficulties are designed to push us towards God, and we ought to be people who pray and beg and sing for God to come and to be more obvious. to be who we know him to be. But the important lesson in Habakkuk is God at his most obvious is not the whole of faith. Living by trust in God, it's not just nostalgically looking back at the past. Trusting in God when he is obviously present, that's wonderful. But faith is more than that. Hebrews says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Which means there's another step. Because faith shines particularly when all signs of blessing, when all signs of God's presence disappear. And that means we need to look at Habakkuk's bridge. Now, do you know what a musical bridge is? It's sort of a part of a song that differs from the rest. It's related to the song, but unrelated. It's the same and different. And what musicians and bands will do is sometimes they'll introduce new progressions or different instrumentation. And in terms of content, the bridge often straddles surprise and release. It's a semi-resolution. It resolves something, but it adds a new wrinkle. Think, for instance, of the now creepy song by The Police, Every Breath You Take. Now, it kind of goes through, and he's singing about how he's with her and watching her and whatever. But when the song breaks into the bridge and the piano starts and Sting stealthily begins to belt out, I'm not going to sing. Since you've been gone, I've been lost without a trace. I feel so cold and I long for your embrace. See, the pair have been together throughout the whole song, but in the bridge they're separate. And Sting is going, and baby, 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 please. See, the bridge and Every Breath You Take, it's thematically different from the song. And based on how he sings it, it's a crucial emotional point to understanding the song. Or think of the Mumford & Sons hit song, I Will Wait. In that song, the bridge doesn't really introduce any new musical notation. Often at live shows, the banjo, the kick drum will hit a bit louder. But what happens is out of nowhere comes trombones and trumpet. And the bridge of I Will Wait, it's bigger and it's soul-stirring. It's this climactic outburst when the brass instruments hit at full blast. See, Habakkuk's bridge, it's a great musical bridge. It adds new elements to the song while staying within the theme. But really you can read this bridge as the summation of the song, but also the summation of the book. It begins in verse 16. It says, I'll read it again. I hear, my body trembles, my lips quiver, rottenness enters my bones, my legs tremble. It's kind of another acknowledgement of how the news about God's works, that his reputation is deeply troubling, it's fear-inducing. And he admits that despite his repeated requests for God to intervene, he now waits quietly for the day of trouble to come upon his invaders. There's no more protests, there's no more complaints. And he says that knowing that the day of trouble might not come in his lifetime, Habakkuk understands that in all likelihood, he will die waiting. Whatever the case is, Habakkuk now fully believes in what God has said. He's resigned himself to it. He knows it will not be a pleasant wait. He knows the rest of his life will not be a life of God's presence and God's blessing, but it will be a life of silence, a life in the void, a life of absence. Habakkuk has accepted that life with God will not work as it did in the past. That he is entering a new and difficult season of God's absence. That God is not going to live up to his expectations. This is what the bridge acknowledges. Some of you are in that place. You're in a new and difficult place you did not want to be. You didn't ask for it. In fact, you probably asked for the opposite. Some of you who are in grade 12, this wasn't how high school was supposed to end. There were supposed to be end-of-year parties, final grades, graduations, proms. Some of you university kids, this wasn't how university was supposed to end. There were supposed to be graduations for you as well. Goodbyes, closure, return to your hometown. For some of you older people, this is not what you intended. You didn't want to spend so much time at home. This was not how your life was supposed to be, this isolation from your kids and grandkids and from broader society. Some of you medical workers, this wasn't how you planned your spring. You didn't want to work overtime. Maybe you didn't want to work at all. You didn't want to have to self-isolate from your family. You didn't intend to face the real possibility of death or sickness at your work. For those of you laid off from work, or your business has closed, or your hours have been cut, you didn't intend to be here. This was not how your life was supposed to be. Some of you single people living on your own, you didn't want to be this lonely. You need your friends. I think for many of us, we have entered a season of God's absence, where our prayers are seemingly unanswered. We have knocked, but only gotten a silence in return. So what then? What do we do in this season? Habakkuk concludes, verse 17. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He enables me to tread on my high places. Habakkuk tells us something incredibly profound. There is coming a time when all signs of prosperity and blessing will be gone. Everything that felt like the good life, wine, produce, meat, economic growth, all these things will be gone. Everything that feels like God's presence, everything that tastes like the blessing of God, all of it will be taken away. And he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, that he is my strength. And friends, I humbly submit to you, this is what faith looks like. The complaining prophet has begun to rejoice, not because his situation has changed, but because he has changed. He is prepared to live by faith even in suffering. And this is not purposeful ignorance. This is not superficial smiling. He has looked every hardship dead in the face and still says, God is enough. I wonder how many of us could say that. That we could say, let all signs of the good life disappear and I will still rejoice in the Lord. That we could say, let me lose my relationships, let me lose my family, I could lose my job, I could lose respect, I could lose my freedom, and even at that moment, I could still rejoice. So now I think we come to the real question. Where do we get the unshakable faith that can endure that sort of devastation? Where do we get faith that's neither ignorant nor superficial, that can provide us deep joy no matter what kind of hell is breaking out around us? Where do we get the joy? Where do we get the strength that Habakkuk is talking about? Like, what's his secret? Well, I can suggest 3 places we can look. First is we can look back, just as Habakkuk did. We can look into history to see what God did, how he worked. The scriptures are not just a textbook. They help us see God. They help with our faith. Secondly, we can look up and around. In creation, we see God's hand. Let it speak to you the way it spoke to Habakkuk. Creation is the book of God's works. It tells us of him. It strengthens our faith. So we look back, we look up and around, but these 2 things are really insufficient on their own. They're secondary things. Thirdly, and most importantly, we look at Jesus. Remember all the things that Habakkuk was hoping for? He wanted to see in his day, a day like the days of old, when God was clearly with his people, when he defeated their enemies, when he used creation to accomplish his will, when he would crush the head of evil. I don't think Habakkuk had much clue, maybe no clue, that what he really wanted was Jesus. Because in Jesus, it's actually the answer for everything he was hoping for. When he says, God, I want you to come and be with your people in a very obvious way. Well, Jesus, born as a baby, to live with us, to walk with us. When Habakkuk prays, God, I want you to use creation to accomplish your will. Well, Jesus, turning water into wine, multiplying food, raising the dead, healing every sickness, restoring creation to its original purpose. God, I want you to destroy our enemies the way you did in the past. Well, Jesus fighting the eternal enemies of humanity, not armies, not Babylon, but sin and death itself, killing off in his death the enemies we could never overcome. Well, God, I want you to kill the head of wickedness who's trying to scatter us. Well, Jesus triumphing over Satan, making a spectacle of the enemies of darkness, not with a sword, but with his death. What Habakkuk was hoping for turned out to be Jesus. So where do we get the faith of Habakkuk? The faith to endure difficulty and questions. I would say this: we are helped by history, we are nudged along by creation, but we are given it because Jesus is the ultimate answer to Habakkuk's questions and complaints. Because Jesus knew what it was like to have to give away everything that belongs to the good life for the sake of another. And this is the seat of your faith. This is the bedrock down at the bottom. This is why you can have joy when what you love is taken from you. Why you can endure when your hands are empty. Why you can trust when your questions overwhelm you, because we have a great high priest who understands and who has died to give you salvation. He is everything we needed. I know today, as you're listening to this, some of you are struggling with faith because of all kinds of issues: job problems, family problems, like mental health problems, loneliness, fear, like all kinds of things. The faith to endure these things ultimately comes from Jesus. And what I would remind you of is you don't really need a new situation. You need a new you. Your heart needs to be different, and so does mine. You need different attitudes and different motivations. We can pray for a new situation, but what we mostly need is a new us. And the only place you can get that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is what Habakkuk figured out and what we need to believe.